Today, as I said, we're going to hear from Reba Carruth. She has a PhD in sociology from the University of Minnesota and an MA from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. I assume that's also up in Minnesota. Also an MA in International Affairs from the American University School of International Service. She is currently an adjunct professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown in Washington, D.C. And she's been very interested in the question of the spiritual destiny of America for really quite some time. She served as a woman institute faculty in one of the courses that we offered a few years ago on that topic. She also has been working on public lectures, programs for historical tours, the White House, the U.S. Capitol, Library of Congress, Mount Vernon. She's been very active at Mount Vernon, I know that, and also various other buildings, and has been quite active, of course, in the Baha'i community. So I think with that introduction, we will turn everything over to Reba.
All right. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm so glad you can join our webinar today on the spiritual destiny of America. So what we're going to do today is use the first out of the 3 webinar sessions to sort of build a common sort of point of understanding and knowledge of the central role of Christianity in the development, the spiritual development of the West and also the creation of America. Now, one of the reasons why this is important is because in the writings of Baha'u'lláh, even the Bab, but certainly Baha'u'lláh, Abdu'l-Baha, and Shoghi Effendi, the central figures of the Baha'i faith, the West in general, and particularly America and the Americas, are given a very high honor as being the place where the light that is being reflected from the Baha'i faith and the accumulation of the teachings of the prophets of the faiths that build up to the Baha'i faith will shine the brightest. And one can ask, how did we come to this position? Because the light, the dawning place of the faith, according to Baha'u'lláh, is always the East. So what we're going to do today is learn a little bit more and try to understand at a deeper level why the West and America are given this role and historically how this comes to be. So for today, what we're going to look at is the historical role of the Christian church. We're going to look a little bit at the split of the Christian church between 3 branches: the Orthodox branch, the Catholic branch, and ultimately the Protestant branch, which gives rise to the creation of America and what we call now the transatlantic world. Now, the reason why this is important is because a lot of people in the West, a lot of people like myself who come from a Christian background, in many cases, we only knew our faith tradition. Either we were Orthodox, we were Catholic, or we were Protestant, but we really were not cognizant of the fact that we are ultimately members of a common faith, which is coming from the teachings of Jesus Christ. And the reason why that's important is because nations and whole structures of law and governance and society and economy have arisen from these interpretations of the teachings of Jesus Christ. Now, one thing I have to say early on, and that's something that, again, needs to be clearly stated, is that Jesus Christ was a practicing Jew. He came from the Jewish tradition. And Christianity, like the Baha'i faith, is a faith that is building on the faith traditions that come before it. And the reason why the church splits into three very important sorts of frameworks of theology is because of this movement of Christianity from this Jewish Hebrew context, but also across territory. So the Christian faith, as you know, is persecuted. Christ is martyred on the cross, but the faith is systematically moved across the Eastern world, and it is taken ultimately to the Western world by the Latins, by the Romans. And what happens in that process is that the eastern part of the church, or what we call the Byzantine portion of the church, which is coming from and building from the period when Christianity is moving through countries today, which would be identified as Syria and Turkey, begin to have theological conflicts with the interpretation of the faith as it's practiced in this case, in Southern Europe and by what is now Italy, or at that time Rome. So that creates the first split. So there's a linguistic split. Latin no longer is used. Greek becomes the language of the church. There's a separation and a removal of the Pope as the center of authority and interpretation of the faith. So that creates the first schism, all right? Another major problem is that when we get to the Europeanization of Christianity, what we see is that it's not just the Romans that have a very strong role in the transformation of the Christian faith, but it is also the growing force and power of the Germanic tribes and princes. So by the time we get to the early Middle Ages, the Catholic Church, which is at that time still in the Western world based in Rome with the Vatican, is facing a very strong challenge and is ultimately in some ways, how can we say it in a diplomatic way? It is split because of the theological dissidence, if you will, of the Germanic, or this time, by that time, the Prussian princes, because Germany didn't exist until Bismarck created it into the late 1870s. But it's the split by these princes who, on the one hand, have a very strong position in the Catholic Church because they are the retainers that are elevated to the level of princes because of their role in serving as mercenaries and defenders of the Catholic Church. But another thing that evolves, which sets into motion the transformation of the West through Christianity, is this Protestant Reformation. Now, initially, we have Henry VIII in England, who breaks with the Catholic Church because, among other things, he wants to be able to divorce, and he also sees a strategic challenge coming from the Vatican and the Catholic Church. So he creates an Anglican church over which he, as King of England, is the head. But the Protestant transformation of Christianity and the transformation of the West really begins to accelerate because of this evolution and this challenge, which is brought forward by Martin Luther, who is himself an Augustine prince, who begins to question the structure of the church, and initially is not seeing himself as a revolutionary, but as someone who wants reforms. So from that, the other thing we're going to look at today is the central role of the West and America in achieving what ultimately is this shared Christian value of creating global family and community based on individuals, families, tribes, and nations that are not necessarily related in terms of bloodline. And even Abdu'l-Baha cites this as a very important area of innovation, if you will, spiritual innovation, if you could call it that, which he sees as something that is very important in understanding the central role of Christianity in transforming the West, but also in creating the framework and the platform for the Western world to be able to understand and to accept the teachings and the principles of the Baha'i faith and the central role of Baha'u'lláh in providing the focal point for the culmination of progressive revelation. So we're going to look a little bit at that today because we have an hour and we don't want to do too many things in an hour. We do have 3 sessions, but we were going to look at that. Now, the spread of Christianity from the East to the West. I just very quickly mentioned that a few minutes ago. I'm just saying this again to say that many people in the West tend to think of Christianity as a Western faith, but it does come from the East. And we have many traditions in Christianity that are still connected to the East. And many people don't know this, but for example, when we look at Thanksgiving in America, George Washington is the one who creates Thanksgiving after the Revolutionary War and the defeat of the British Empire. Thanksgiving was also not just a feast of food, but it was also a time of fasting and giving thanks. So here again, this notion of fasting, which we in the Baha'i faith uphold today as part of our spiritual tradition, is not something new for the Western world. This is another tradition that is coming in some ways still from the Eastern tradition of fasting, which still in many parts of Western Europe and in the Christian faith and in the Western world is still alive and in some ways gaining more attention. Now, the establishment of the Christian church after the collapse of Rome is very important because here again, you see new forces coming to the forefront. You see the Saxon people, the Germanic tribes, really becoming the power brokers of Europe. And why do I say that? I say that because over time, they are basically conglomerating the empires which initially were seen as the Kingdom of Italy and eventually what would become the Kingdom of what is now France or Burgundy. And they unify that under what is called the Holy Roman Empire. Now, you don't have to worry. I'm going to be giving you a list of readings and websites at the end of this lecture, and you will have sort of a more complete compilation at the end of this three-part course, so you don't have to worry about having specific notes on all of this. But just know that the Holy Roman Empire was basically a combination of this Germanic world, which has become not just the defender of the Vatican and the Christian faith, but has become in many ways the ruling structure in that church, begins to use this power and to use the principles of the Christian faith to reorganize Europe. At that time, we also see that the Eastern Orthodox Church has been in many ways divorced from both the Catholic Church and the Protestant structure. But today, I must say, the good thing is that in the Christian world, because of this very dramatic persecution of Christian people, which tends to go under the radar of news and of understanding in Europe and America and other parts of the world, because of this growing awareness, we see that there's mobilization to accelerate the reconciliation of the Eastern Orthodox Church with the Catholic Church and for reconciliation of the Protestant Church with the Catholic Church and ultimately reconciliation of all three branches. Now, let's look a little bit closer at this Protestant Reformation, which was set into motion by Martin Luther, because that is a very important transformation in terms of the universal principles of the faith. Again, the Baha'i faith is based on universal principles that basically are pivoting around this principle of the oneness of humanity, the oneness of peoples, and the oneness of God. So what does this Augustine monk do that revolutionizes the West and lead to the creation of America? Well, the first thing he does is he publishes 95 theses and places them on the church door. Now, the purpose of these theses is to bring to attention to the hierarchy of the church that something has gone wrong. The priests control all the governing structures, they control education, they control society, they control economy. But for some reason, Martin Luther begins to understand that there's too much of a divergence from the spiritual teachings of Jesus Christ. And there have been, over time, an accumulation of things that have nothing to do with the relationship between God and man. And he also sees that salvation requires an individual relationship to God. Now that's very important because in the Baha'i faith, we believe in independent investigation of truth. In other words, you can't buy your way to salvation. In the Middle Ages, in the Catholic Church, if you were a very rich family or noble family, your sins could be forgiven if you paid a certain amount of money, if you gave your eldest son to the church as a priest or your eldest daughter as a nun, and that also tied you to the fortunes or the misfortunes of that church. It also allowed you to have church walls and church windows painted with religious themes in which your family was featured. So that's one of the things that begins to not sit well with Martin Luther and causes him to, on the first stage, to just articulate this as something that needs to be discussed. Now, spiritual and intellectual independence by each believer is required. What is important to know here is that even before the Protestant Revolution and Reformation that really split Europe and results in conflict, the 7 Years' War, which is played out in the Americas. Even before that, what we see is that the Germanic people have decided to put knowledge of God in the hands of the people. In the Catholic Church, the priests controlled the knowledge. They were the ones who could read. They were the ones who could interpret the Bible. So you have the Gutenberg press that comes into being, and it begins to print copies of the Bible, not just in Latin, but in German. People have to be able to understand the teachings in their language. Moral conscience of individual believers, not clergy or the Vatican, is the path to salvation. Martin Luther is known for the very important quote, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Now, at a certain point, Martin Luther is brought before the clergy and the different levels of authority in the Catholic Church. And he is made to explain and to argue his thesis. But the real reason he's brought there is to really give justification as to why he needs to be excommunicated and also why he needs to be marked for execution. But he still does this, which means that even when things look dark, the individual has to stand and has to have mechanisms of morality and ethics which are directly coming from his belief in God, his own spiritual sort of compass and understanding, which cannot be delegated to other structures. In the Bible, in Christianity, we are taught that we don't know who we're fighting with. We think we're fighting with a person. We think we're fighting with a movement. But there are all these different levels of power. There are governments, there are kings, there are different levels of institutions that are standing behind things. So we never know 100% what it is we're having to deal with. So we have to, as Martin Luther says, have that mighty fortress. Now, part of that mighty fortress, he says, build me a mighty fortress, which is not just the physical church, but that mighty fortress has to be in each and every one of us. And in the Western world, in Europe and America right now, there is no question that we really have to, once again, whether we see ourselves as believers, non-believers, atheists, we have to acknowledge that we stand, we exist, we come into being because of this foundation which was laid in the East by Jesus Christ, whose teachings came and spread to the West and created the structures within which we now live. Once again, Holy Scriptures must be provided to each believer, and each believer is responsible. Not your clergy, not all these other structures, but you as an individual are responsible. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that the Reformation not only creates new interpretations of theology, but it also creates nations. It creates different structures of government, society, economy, a rule of law. The other thing to keep in mind is that a lot of people don't know this, but because of the Reformation, you have these wars, what they call the 7 Years' Wars in Europe, in which The Protestant nations and the Catholic nations are fighting for territories and markets, and they extend themselves all around the world, Africa, Asia, and ultimately to the Americas. And it is in the Americas that this Protestant Reformation begins to really reverberate in a way that creates, in some respects, a platform for this universal faith, this oneness of God acknowledgement, the oneness of humanity, and common society and structure for world society, which Baha'u'lláh is bringing in with the universal principles. Now, that's very important to know, and that's something we'll get back to, not necessarily in this session, but we can talk about it in the question and answer period. But this is very important. What is important to know is that while Martin Luther was marked for death, he is aided by German princes. They're called, one family in particular is called the Ernestines. They're in the eastern part of Germany, which is now the lander of Saxony. And they kidnap him and take him to the palace. They say for his protection. So he goes incognito, he grows a beard, and it's there that he's translating the Bible from Latin into German. Martin Luther was also a university professor, and he has other professors on his faculty that are aiding him. They're all sort of coming together as this brotherhood of Prussian and Germanic priests and scholars that begin to translate the Old and the New Testament into German so that people can follow it, they can understand it, and they can apply it to their lives in Prussia and Europe and wherever. And they also see that it's their responsibility to spread this understanding of the relationship between God and each individual person around the world. Now, the other thing that happens that's very important to know is that these Ernestine priests are also talking to Martin Luther because they feel that some of these teachings need to be put into the form of government reforms, in the form of public education for girls and women, and also education for girls and women, boys and men, right? That's a revolution there, all right? They also become the royal line, which becomes part of this electorate of Hanover. So during the Holy Roman Empire, the emperor could be was elected, but he was also in many ways placed in that position of being head of, at that time, what was the Holy Roman Empire, or the Christian structure in Europe, by these networks of rulers. So the same thing begins to happen in Western Europe. What happens ultimately is that the King of England is placed on the throne through the electorate of Hanover. So the Stuarts are removed. They were a Catholic royal line. They are removed, and a Prussian prince, a Protestant Prussian prince, has to sit on the royal throne. So here again, we think we're looking at the British Empire with an English king, but he is really a Prussian king, or a Prussian prince who has become king. And by the way, his wife Charlotte is one of the first identified royal consorts in Europe who comes directly from an African line. So it's very interesting now. We're coming full circle again. The empire that created the colonies here in the Americas is once again having connection with people that were in some ways moved to this hemisphere through the transatlantic slave trade and through the colonial system. Now, having said all that, what is interesting to know is that freedom of religion and creation of the principles which give rise to the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and all these founding documents which create the United States of America, but also begin to influence through the Enlightenment and other movements that begin to take place in Europe by the 18th and 19th century. All of these things, again, are derivative from these core teachings of universal community, of universal family that are coming from the Christian teachings. And these Christian teachings, again, What are they coming from? They're coming ultimately from their roots in the Old Testament, which is what Abdu'l-Bahá refers to as the Jewish Bible. So it's a combination of these two things which lead us to this understanding of Christianity as a faith, which in many ways still has its roots in the East, but was able to move beyond constraints of the East. So that's something in terms of flexibility of the West, and particularly of Europe and America in the 21st century, that's important to know. Now, the Protestant Reformation in Europe, the emergence of America, the Americas, and transatlantic expansion into the West. So in terms of the spiritual destiny of America and the West, it's important to know that in the writings, it's not just Europe that is the West. It's the other subsidiary structures that Europe was able to create in the Americas. So the United States of America is one very important dimension, or one very important nation in that, but it's also Canada and the other nations of the West. In fact, Bahá'u'lláh, when he's speaking to the rulers, he speaks to the president of America, but also the rulers of the other republics. And it's fascinating because what you have here in the Americas is really the coming together through this conflict of these European powers, the Catholic and the Protestant, the coming together through these colonies, which are really market structures. They weren't societies that were initially created. They were market structures that were established here to extract wealth, natural resources, and whatever they could to basically build Europe. They weren't set up to build these nations here, but they are building not just from material wealth, but from indigenous knowledge and from the strength and the support, which in many ways gets transformed into very high level support from the transatlantic slave trade. Now, I do work at Mount Vernon part-time as a history interpreter. We have a wonderful exhibition there called Lives Bound Together, and it's about how George Washington relies on freed and enslaved labor for the Continental Army, right? We have no army, we have no navy. He's losing all the battles. By the time King George III has decided it's time to end this revolution over here, who is he sending? He's sending Scottish Highland regiments. He's sending soldiers from the soldier trade from the German region of Hesse. He even considers going to Morocco and having the Moroccan king send troops from Morocco to help. And ultimately, he recruits some soldiers from Ethiopia to try to suppress this rebellion. So George Washington decides he has to break ranks with conventional thinking, and he recruits free and enslaved black men for the Continental Army. And he decides that if they survive this, because in fact they're fighting for a higher good, because George Washington believes very strongly that a society, a nation has to be based on core principles of morality and civility, that they should be given their freedom. And at the end of his life, he rewards them by calling for the ending of slavery in America. He and Thomas Jefferson realized if they try to end slavery at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, they will lose the country. It's even so dramatic that Thomas Jefferson tells George Washington, the North and the South will not hang together, but they will hang on you. But it's because of this strong belief in God, the creation of a country, the United States of America, which is premised on belief in God, up front, no question, that we see America and the Americas going in a direction now and in the future, which is not necessarily clear to all of us, but in some ways can be more clearly understood if we can keep that vision of something being created essentially from nothing and emerging to something that becomes the pinnacle of admiration by the East and the West, which is what Abdu'l-Bahá says ultimately America and the West will achieve. Now, for the sake of time, just very quickly, why is the continent of America in the eyes of the one true God, the land wherein his splendors of his light will be revealed and the mysteries of his faith shall be unveiled, and where the righteous will abide and the free will assemble. Part of it is because most people don't realize that we are a colony, or were a colony of Great Britain. Very few people here had strong pedigree. They were sent here as indentured white workers, as enslaved workers. And the indigenous people here ultimately were the victims of dispossession, right? But that is not where it ends. That's where it begins. And that's where the standing up under these beliefs of these core principles, these universal principles, empowers them to stand and to reverberate across the world. So these core principles and this not being afraid to speak to power, regardless of how low you are, again, echoing the disciples. Abdu'l-Baha says, be as the disciples to the Christian people. And that resonates because the disciples were uneducated. They were few in number. They were despised because of their lowliness. And in the end, what were they able to do? They were able to shape a world which is still unfolding. So America will be given this role, which it will have to achieve in spite of shortcomings and setbacks. But it's given this role, and it will be given an even higher role as things begin to unfold with this integration of peoples and nations and systems into common structures. Not that local and national things or regional things will disappear, but they will have common foundations. Leading the world in achieving international agreement. That means that all parties must be given voice to. All right, that was one of the things that led to the revolution. So we're helping the British fight the French, push them up into Canada in the French and Indian War, but we are being called on to give everything to cover the war debts of Great Britain. We have no voice in what we're doing. Our land is being destroyed. Tobacco becomes unsustainable. It's relying on unskilled enslaved labor. George Washington sees that it's sustainable agriculture and natural resources and abundant land that is the future and the wealth of the nation. It's skilled trades, not enslaved labor, that is the future of wealth and well-being of society. And finally, the establishment of the most great peace. Now, over Mount Vernon, George Washington places the dove of peace on top of his house. And he says that ultimately peace is what all nations and peoples are basically focused on. And he sees education, and in particular, moral and civic education, as the foundation to this. It's good citizenship and leadership. Now, very quickly, because I don't want to take up all of our time, I want to leave plenty of time for questions and answers. I just want to call your attention to some of the writings and scriptures in the Baha'i faith, which talk about the connection with Christianity. Here again, Baha'u'lláh and the Tablets of Baha'u'lláh makes it clear that the prophets originate in the East. He starts with Abraham. He goes on with Moses. Zoroaster also comes from the East. Zoroaster is the first monotheistic lawgiver. And Jesus Christ and Muhammad, the Bab, Baha'u'lláh, they all come from the East. But the Bab tells the people of the West to come forth from their cities and to aid his cause. Now that's very important, because essentially what that is saying is that the people of the West already have at their disposal at the time when he is giving his revelation to the people of Persia, they already have at their disposal these principles. What they have to do is to come out and just push this, proclaim this, move this from the highest to the lowest. And also, you see here where Baha'u'lláh is telling the republics, the presidents of the republics and all the nations and rulers of the Americas, to bind the broken with the hands of justice and to crush the oppressor with the rod of his commandments. Now, this is very interesting, because a lot of people in Christianity believe that it's just by turning the other cheek that things will be rectified, through just loving your enemy as yourself, that things will be rectified. But it's also clear that there is something important here in terms of managing good and evil in society. And the management of that is upholding and promulgating and enforcing spiritual principles. Finally, I just want to call your attention to some of the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá and Shoghi Effendi, which allude to the very important station of Jesus Christ. In the West, in America, in Europe, it became fashionable to become secular, or to become, how should I put it, as modern people who didn't need religion, who didn't need to uphold their faith tradition, to be people who are seen as being enlightened and exploring everyone else's tradition, but not upholding their own. And what's very important is that it's that tradition which in many ways is the platform for the others to come and coexist and live together. So now in the West and in America, we're beginning to realize, regardless of how strong or how weak our belief system is in Catholicism or the Orthodox Church or the Protestant Church, more and more it's beginning to resonate what Jesus Christ and the teaching of Christianity did and how it created the world which we live in the West, and how in some ways it shaped the world and emerging world society which is coming forward. And I think in these writings by Abdu'l-Bahá, where he's talking about what Jesus Christ actually did, what his existence and life actually did in terms of reverberating throughout all of creation, what his death did in terms of ushering in a new period, a new millennium within which other new seeds could be planted. I think that's very important in the age in which we live. So to summarize for you today, one of the things I want you to think about today, or to ask questions about, or to debate, is the following points. Jesus Christ and the Christian Church do establish this framework for universal norms and values which are necessary for a human family, for a common society, a world society, a community of nations. And it has to move beyond dependence on family, bloodline, tribes, and other sort of narrowly defined notions of community. The reconciliation and unification of the Christian Church is also very telling, because it was the persecution of the Christian Church, first by the Hebrews and the Jewish community, the Jewish faith, and then eventually by the Romans, and then by others, which led to this remarkable growth and spread of the Christian faith, not just in the East, but in the West, and ultimately around the world. The teaching of Jesus Christ and Christianity spread across the world through the efforts of the disciples. Again, uneducated, poor, but able to speak truth to power. When we think about the destiny of America, what were we looking at? We're looking at a group of untrained, poor, unskilled, unqualified people, people who aren't even seen as people by the European powers, who rose up and eventually topple the British Empire. And what do they put in its place? They put in a structure that is based on these universal principles and God-given rights and obligations. Again, looking at that continual line that Christianity gives us. We always have to know that it's the people at the bottom as well at the top that have to be brought together and move in a common direction. Finally, Abdu'l-Bahá tells us to be as the disciples, that we have to teach the Baha'i faith and its principles in large part through linking it more strongly and systematically and formally with these common and universal shared principles of Christian prophecy and teachings that link all peoples and races and faiths and nations. Now, in our next session, we'll go a little bit deeper, actually a lot deeper, so that we can understand and know what these common Christian and Baha'i norms, socio-economic values, and institutional foundations of America and the West and emerging world society are. Because that's where Christianity, in many ways, provides a foundation, but the Baha'i faith provides more specific guidance and specificity on how we move forward with that in a world which really is in turmoil. And it's in turmoil because of rapid disintegration, but also rapid integration, which is going on at the same time. So I'm going to stop there.
And I want to thank Reba for her presentation.